I want to be very clear on two things at the very top. One, this debate is not about anti-vaxxers. Often these individuals do things for a variety of other reasons, religious reasons, distrust in the state. I think the majority of this narrative is pushed by medical experts themselves, who often are unsure as to the types of over-prescription and dominance that GPs have over the vast array of things that they're able to advise individuals, and recognize that in many instances, medical health has a gray area where you need a second reference, where you need a variety of different perspectives to be able to take into account not only the different treatments that are available for a particular disease, but also the patient's needs and their incentive to do and undergo those particular treatments. I think on op, it is significantly more likely, if they want to run the idea that people go into the idea of anti-vaxxing or the idea that the medical community itself is something uniquely harmful, when you create a dichotomy between the types of actors that are likely to be perpetuating this narrative. Because on their side of the house, it is only individuals who are anti-vaxxers who say you distrust the state. So at the point at which you've been failed by a particular community in terms of hospitals, if you've been failed by a particular treatment, I think that is the extreme radicalization that you're much more likely to enter to when they dominate the discourse and narrative. I think on our side of the house, when you have medical experts that are able to perpetuate a narrative that doctors, sure, might have expertise, but don't always know what is definitely best for you and should take into account the individual's consent as well, it's much more likely that you diversify the types of conversations that you're able to have. And it's likely that they do this, not only because they have an incentive to do so, but they have the capacity, they're able to understand what are the different types of things that are necessary. But secondly, I want to know why people are still likely to go into hospitals and go and take treatment on their side of the house. One, you're socialized very often in things like schools to believe in things like modern science, which is why you have an incentive to go into things and trust those things to some extent. I think secondly, very often, things like hospitals are unsubstitutable by things like OTC medicines. You often need a prescription for things like that, which is why you have a deadlock in terms of the way in which you actually have to enter these particular institutions anyway. But thirdly, I think there's some degree of self-preservation. Sure, you might not trust them entirely, but we think it's still likely that you trust them to some extent. And at the end of the day, it's a narrative debate. That's the delta, right? To some extent, we think there's an increased bar for doctors and medical experts to explain the kinds of treatments that they're doing towards individuals on their side of the house, on our side of the house, that doesn't exist on their side of the house when you have complete blind trust. Yeah, clarification.
Yeah, you're not defending a narrative, you're opposing a narrative. So you shouldn't characterize what your narrative looks like, but what ours.
So I literally just said it, right? Medical experts are likely to take into account the variety of different things that happen and explain why doctors are unlikely to know every single thing. And there's a variety of different considerations that you have to take into account. For instance, your patient's consent. Maybe you do want to go into chemotherapy. Maybe you don't want to go into chemotherapy. But that, at the end of the day, is the patient's autonomy and choice. The fact that there's a variety of different medicines for particular diseases, that they are more likely to tell doctors that you should give the option towards these individuals that they're able to do, that they're able to choose those particular things. First question, why is there likely to be blind trust on their side of the house in doctors and medical health professionals? There are three reasons. One, the veil of linguistics. That is to say, very often individuals hide behind fancy terms that individuals don't understand. And at the point at which they don't understand them, they're likely to trust the individuals who are telling them that this particular thing is the only way in which you're able to solve your particular problem. I think secondly, there is a glorification of doctors in many cultures. My parents told me you should go study medicine instead of econ. I think it's likely that that perpetuates into a variety of different social discussions in terms of the way in which we treat doctors and their importance in society. But I think three, there's a degree of moral indebtedness.
Sure.
That's why in the instance in which you have medical malpractice cases, the majority of public opinion is often in the favor of the doctor because they're somewhat sacrificing their life to save you. They've taken a Hippocratic oath. They're much more likely to take into account the variety of different things that you have to take into account. I think that's why on their side of the house you have blind trust in doctors to an exceptionally large extent. I think there are several harms that result of this. One, very simply a low burden is overprescription. In a variety of different contexts, it's likely that you go towards the most extreme type of, what's it called, the antibiotics, like the most intense antibiotics that are likely to be exceptionally harmful in terms of the side effects that they often have, likely because sometimes doctors are directly related to medical companies or because they just don't want to see them back again, which is why you might forego more natural treatments that might be more beneficial to your body. That's a direct harm towards patients' health. And even if it's small, it's very low burden and applies to a vast array of different instances. I think secondly, you're more likely to do things like get a second reference or referral. And in many instances that's important, not only because of the variety of different types of medicines that are existing for a particular individual, but also because very often you might need a surgery, you might not need a surgery, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like what life you want to live. So if I want to play badminton, I can't do that anymore because my knee is fucked. I could get a surgery and then play badminton competitively, but I don't want to because I can live a normal life even without getting that surgery. So it's kind of the types of choices that individuals want to have, and getting a second reference, whether that particular surgery is necessary, is much more likely to increase patients' autonomy. I think thirdly, there's some degree of catharsis for patients. At the the end of the day, there's some instances in which medical treatments go wrong. But on their side of the house, it's much more likely that you tell these individuals, well, fuck it, there's nothing that could have been done because the doctor knows the best. On our side, you're able to vent the frustrations against the medical system to some extent, because at the end of the day, it's not going to be perfect. But in some instances, you're able to make sure that these individuals feel heard. On their side, they're statistic, they're an anomaly, they're individuals who are put on the side as individuals who don't matter. On our side, they're more likely to be heard by the medical community. In these particular instances, these things fail. I think fourthly, you put out increase in options, which increases the patient's autonomy. It's much more likely that patients feel like they're aware of what's happening with their health. But in the worst instances, even if people do things like self-medicate or self-prescribe or don't go to the hospital, in some instances we think it's fine. It's traumatic to go into things like chemotherapy. It's traumatic to do things like a variety of other conditions that are sometimes very difficult to do. It puts your family and yourself under a lot of stress. I think in the instance in which you increase the autonomy of patients to be able to say, I don't want to do this, that is something that is inherently good. The impacts of this, I think, are spectrumized. I think in many instances it might be low burden impact on things like overprescription. I think in some instances it's things like catharsis, the ability to be able to not feel like a statistic on a spreadsheet. But I think it also is the direct impact on patients' health, because in some instances doctors aren't perfect, but you're much more likely to get checks and balances on our side of the house when you have a second referral. Second argument is why increase in skepticism to the health system broadly is something that is good. I think there are two reasons for why this is the case. One, informed consent increases. You're more likely as a doctor to walk through the process of a particular treatment with a patient at the point at which they're less trusting. The bar is higher for you to undergo that treatment in the first place. I think this not only means that patients feel more, or like they have more self-autonomy, but it also means there is a democratization of the information that comes within the medical system. Because very often it's very difficult to check and balance not only as patients, but also different medical experts in the instance in which people are able to hide behind fancy research and fancy words. I think at the point you actually have to explain to these individuals what is the side effect, what are the types of processes, what are the harms, and how long it's going to take to a variety of different individuals, and the bar is significantly higher. It means that not only do these medical practices get better, but it also means it's better targeted towards the particular patients who need it, because bad doctors can be scrutinized more on our side of the house. For those many reasons, OG.
For your speech, and we now welcome the Leader of the Opposition to begin the off case.
A caveat before my speech. I'm going to start my speech with an anecdote that's very close and personal and very recent to me. I might tear up a bit, I might stumble a bit, so I ask that you don't immediately badger me with the POI at 100, but give me a moment to gather my bearings back again. That would be very much appreciated. Thank you. 2 weeks ago, my grandma died of cancer, which was most likely treatable in the vast majority of its cases, but she refused to admit that she was in pain until the very end of her life, and there was nothing more to do. She did this because she believed that she knew her pain and her experiences better than any doctor could potentially realize, and she died of a thing sooner than was her time, and she did not have to. This is the case coming from opening opposition. The fringe cases where things get misdiagnosed, or diseases that have never been heard about get treated as different things, are very, very rare and less important than preventing preventable diseases and deaths and removing family members before their time, causing suffering onto them and everybody else that they hold dear. What does this narrative realistically look like? Note that the narrative of this house, like doctors know best, looks like when you feel ill, when you feel unwell, when there is a problem, the first person you turn to is not the internet, is not introspection, is not friends. You firstly go to the doctor and you listen to what they have to say. That means you trust the medical practice in and of itself. Does not necessarily mean you trust every single doctor you meet. You know that there are frauds, you know that there are bad doctors out there. And that probably means that even though you trust medicine in and of itself, you still are incentivized to ask for second opinions. You ask a different type of specialist, right? You don't go to a nephrologist with your heart problems, but you also don't go to some local quack that you don't know if he's good, right? You read reviews online for which doctors are specialized, right? You pay private hospitals if you need to go to experts who you know are the best best in their field, and you ask for second opinions if you think that somebody has misdiagnosed you or has not heard everything that you want to say. This is especially true if you come from a group that is more likely to be discredited by medical professionals, e.g. women who don't get listened to as much by medical professionals, so you ask for a female doctor who's more likely to listen to you, or a doctor you know has good experiences with women, right? Or if you're a minority, or if you have a language barrier, or things like that. Cool. What does the counter-narrative likely to look like? Because note, with the absence of this narrative, opposing it, creates a counter-narrative in society. Opening up the government want to say this is not about anti-vaxxers, but they can't just say this as a statement that expect us all to believe it. What does this mean? That the anti-vaxxers exist in society whether you want it or not. At the point where you lose the narrative that doctors know best, anti-vaxxers gain popularity and prevalence. Why? Because anti-vaxxer is extremely able to reach out to a wide range of people. If somebody tells me that my child might die from a vaccine, I am going to be very worried. I do not want my child to die. And if there is no trust in a higher power that knows better than me, then I may as well defer to anecdotal evidence of people I trust and know. Because note that we all trust people asymmetrically, right? I trust Paula much more than I trust Mac Rosen because Paula scams me less. But to that extent, I will trust Paula when she tells me something happens. But I should trust people who are objective. I should trust the panel, right? I should trust doctors more than I trust random individuals, even if they're close to me personally. Even if they can tell stories I can personally relate to. That's how anti-vaxxers gain popularity on their side of the house. Because the narrative is not doctors know best. You should know best. You have introspection into your own personal body. You know where your pain is. You know where it's located. You know how it impacts your body. Note that this pushes you into a couple of things. One, it pushes you into alternative medicine. What Aniket says, natural things that are better for your body. This is probably very problematic because natural medicine that is good for your body is one, very often ineffective. It stems from traditional medicine that is less effective than actual targeted things made in a specialized laboratory, targeting specific mechanisms in your body that are able to prevent diseases from manifesting or cure symptoms. Secondly, even if it is to some degree effective, it is very often an opportunity cost because you don't start treatment soon enough. E.g., you take herbal medicines to help with your pain, so you don't treat the source of the pain soon enough, so you die of cancer sooner than later, or you get long-term illnesses sooner than later, right? Then Aniket says, but doctors overprescribe antibiotics, but it fails to realize that this is much more common on their side of the house. Note that on our side of the house, doctors are prescribing antibiotics less and less because they go to medical conferences that tell them, overprescribing antibiotics is really bad because it builds super bacteria that are resistant to this. On our side of the house, they're more likely to give you a medicine that is going to be slower acting, but not develop super bacteria. Well, on their side of the house, if there is a belief that the individual knows best, they're most likely to try to control their doctor and say, no, I only want antibiotics. Why? Because antibiotics are going to get my problem rid as fast as possible. I have other priorities in life. I need to go to work. I need to go to EUDC and roll around in a wheelchair. I need to do things that are prioritized for my own body. Therefore, I will take the quick fix, even if it harms me long term, or if it harms society and the medical practice in general. So it is worse on their side of the house. The rest of the metal is integrated. Now, the alternative also looks like pushed by governmental institutions who have autonomy or have the ability to coerce individuals. This looks like RFK telling people you shouldn't get the vaccine because it may cause autism, it may cause cancer, and you believe these narratives because RFK is telling you these things. He's a government official, he is a respected leader, he's a Kennedy for God's sake. He must know something, and there is no counter-narrative telling me that I should trust somebody else with medical knowledge. Why are doctors much better than this? But before that, Max, what's up?
Do doctors know best about the COVID lockdowns?
Yeah, for sure, bro. They know much better. They do know best about the COVID lockdowns. If they did not do the things that they did, many more people would have died, hospitals would have overflowed, and people would have died. There are immunocompromised people that would have suffered if this was not happening. We may say, COVID was bad, but it was much better than the alternative, and all will have a hard time to prove otherwise. Why are doctors probably the best people here to know things? One, they're motivated. It takes a lot of motivation and energy to go to a medical school and actually spend 10, 15 years of life specializing in something. It's a very long education. Secondly, they are specialized in things. They have subspecialties. There's nephrologists. They deal with 2 or 3 or 4 diseases. With the rise of doctors, with the rise of trust in doctors, there is also a rise of incentive to be an individual trusted in society and therefore go to medical school and specialize in something so we get a proliferation of the medical experience and therefore we are able to better help a larger amount of people. Thirdly, very importantly, they still ask for patient input. One of the primary things that doctors do when you can't get a patient, you ask them about their quality of lives. There's actual forms that they have to fill in about the quality of life of the patient, right? So they actually care about this and prescribe based on this, right? They're informed of new medicines because they go to conferences, they read medical magazines, something that people are not informed about. Individuals, on the other hand, use anecdotal evidence. They use fear. They're more persuaded by fear. They're more likely to get persuaded into buying snake oil. They're more likely to go into echo chambers of distrust where anecdotal evidence and rare adverse effects are overemphasized, right? They don't understand each small implication and how their disease might interact with others. But also, how drugs work is much different. On our side of the house, drugs are targeted towards doctors, so you build drugs that actually cure effects. On their side of the house, if the individual is the primary buyer of drugs because the individual is primary decision maker of medical treatment, therefore you incentivize drug makers to create over-the-counter medication that can be bought by every individual, but these drugs are by definition less effective at curing diseases and more likely to be effective at curing symptoms because you want people to believe that their drug is working, and the only way for them to know if the drug is working is do they feel better. So you get more sales of ibuprofen, less chemotherapy, very bad.
Thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I apologise for my cough. I've had Panamanian children. I now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the Gov case.
I'm firstly going to explain what this narrative looks like, actually explain what the counterfactual is, because I think the response from O is quite uncharitable. Then I'm going to talk about patient welfare, and finally establish why there's still going to be decent levels of trust in medicine on the outside of the house. 1. What does this narrative look like? I think opening opposition offers you no sound response as to why it's unlikely going to be the case in a vast majority of instances where people actually go and engage in extensive process of trying to get things like second opinions. The reason being is that the default presumption is that you assume that the doctors know best, and for me to think otherwise means that I am the problem because I naturally don't believe in science. More importantly, there are 2 reasons as to which go unresponded as to why you're so unlikely to do things like extensive second opinions. The first is that there's a lot of complicated language that exists when it comes to the process of explaining your conditions. What this means is that you naturally trust the doctors to begin with because you think that they are best able to explain your situation. More importantly, the reasons why this is bad is that it manifests in blind trust. The response we coming up from opening opposition is just say, well, people do things like get second opinions all the time. Why is this unlikely going to be the case? 1, I don't think people engage in the massive collection of obtaining things like second opinions because the default presumption is that the doctors are right. But more importantly, when you are one of the few individuals who actually goes and tries to get a second opinion, you question and shun for it. What was wrong with the first doctor? Why are you going to get a second opinion? More often than not, doctors want to maintain a unified front, which is why they're unlikely to do things like be very willing to give you a second opinion because it undermines the collective trust you have in doctors under their side of the house. But secondly, and more importantly, it's a very laborious and time-intensive process. If it is true that most individuals lead very, very busy lives, you just don't have the capacity to go and get these second opinions because they're very time-consuming. In the counterfactual, we simply say that the doctor's words aren't the words of the gospel. What this means is that doctors likely have to compensate for the perceived loss of trust in their best case, where you have to do things like explain your procedures far, far more, rather than just giving the simple term and explaining what the potential side effects of it are. Maybe in our worst case, you do things like consult other complementary practices like homeopathic medicine, but we think this is the minority of the instances, given that a large part of the world has just been socialized to believe in things like modern medicine. This has several implications. 1, on discourse surrounding the medical profession. What we explain is that the people who likely engage in the criticism of doctors are those with a background in science. Maybe it's also lay people who've had a negative experiences with the medical profession, but the reason as to why this is true is that look at when COVID first started. There was a lot of well-established scientific research into how the vaccine potentially is not safe to do things like mandate rollout for everyone. I think these individuals will likely come to the spotlight under outside the house because people just naturally distrust individuals who just have absolutely no experience in medicine whatsoever. I think you need some credibility ability to make your voice have a sway. But secondly, and more importantly, this breaks the monopoly that anti-vaxxers have on distrust towards the state, which exclusively exists under their side of the house. The problem is that when you continue to hold the belief that doctors know best, you can't also criticize them to a significant degree because there's no better option than the doctor. This is what creates a false dichotomy under their side. To be pro-science, you must be pro-doctor, which leaves the anti-vaxxers all the room to monopolize discussion. This means that you can't do things like fight their logic with things like fact and science, which we exclusively get under our side. In the worst case, what do we trade off? Maybe more people don't always go to the hospital, but why is this okay? One, we contend there's an over-medicalization of personal issues in the status quo. The doctors tell you, take this medicine to deal with your pain, when that is not always necessary. I think individuals, once they start on medicine, they have to continue the full regimen. But secondly, and more importantly, I think individuals feel validated about their suffering in the event things go wrong. More on this later. More importantly, thirdly, this is the best exercise of autonomy. This is now when I want to chat about patient welfare. And the frame for this claim is very simple. For most patients, they're still likely to go to the hospital for all the reasons that Aniket tells you. But there's a unique subset of individuals who are very large in quantum who doubt whether or not the doctor has their best interests at heart, have concerns about whether or not this invasive surgery is the one and only method to deal with their pain. What changes in the counterfactual? Three things. One, I think healthcare treatment becomes far, far more patient-centric. The problem is that administrative processes have hijacked the process of getting things like informed consent. Oftentimes, the surgeon consulting you just gives you a form to read and sign. They don't actually sit by your side to walk you through the entire process to feel like you're heard. You're very, very detached from the interaction and engagement with the patient. You view it as a chore. Secondly, I think we get the reduction of invalidation of patient suffering. POC and women in modern science just have treatments that aren't built off of the bodies of, themselves, right? Because most of modern medicine, unfortunately, was constructed of what worked for a white man. The implication of this is that when treatment doesn't work under their side of the house, these individuals don't feel validated. Look at how many fat individuals go to the hospital, but their doctors tell them, maybe you should think about losing weight first, that would help with their health issues, without realizing that there's an underlying problem. CEO's gonna be like, I think fat people losing weight is a great idea. The problem is that there's so many individuals for which this is just extremely inaccessible. They try to lead healthy lives, but it's just virtually impossible to drop those pounds. I think these individuals feel far more hurt under outside the house when it's not always the case that the doctor knows best. Sometimes you as the patient might be right. Thirdly, and more importantly, I think this fosters greater trust between doctors and patients. The issue in the status quo is that doctors are far too lax when it comes to dealing with patients. You don't invest time in connecting with them. The bridge in understanding is precisely where the distrust against doctors stems from. Because when things go wrong, you want to sue your doctor to get your day in court. That is why you have so much medical malpractice litigation under their side of the house. Before we move on, is there a PY from CEO?
Right, so on your side of the house, you both have the crackpots and the medical establishment. Why is the medical establishment criticism stronger than the crackpot criticism?
So the reason is, firstly, crackpot criticism doesn't actually have any logical basis to it, right? It's mostly based on things like fleeting emotions. When the scientific researchers actually explain their processes because of the democratization of information, I think the average layperson is far more likely to buy into this. On the weighing two parts here. One, I think you actually get the maximization of patient autonomy. What we force the medical profession to do is actually care about patients. Any care that you have under their side of the house is not genuine. It is only reactive out of the fear that you might get more litigation in the future. This engages in their best case, where doctors are in fact scared of losing patients to competitors. And the upshot of this is that all the benefits to the individual flow downstream from being able to exercise that autonomous choice. Finally then, on just Finally then, on why I think individuals are able to make far more dignified choices under our side. Independent of whether or not you get solvency, I think we give individuals an outlet to vent about their problems that they have with the medical profession. Unfortunately, not all treatments can be cured. Many individuals lead lives with chronic illnesses, but under their side, they're shamed when they don't go to the hospital. You could have saved your life. You made a mistake by not going to the hospital. At the very least, in the worst of instances where people unfortunately die, at least that was a dignified choice they made after they had all the information available on the table. We think individuals know their own bodies best, but it's only under outside where you don't trust the doctor blindly, where you force the medical profession to actually divulge all information out there. You force them to change for the betterment of patients. I've never been prouder to propose.
Thank the Speaker very much for their speech. We now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off top half.
I want to clarify why you still can seek second opinion on our side of the house. The motion says that you distrust doctors. On our side of the house, you trust doctors, but you might realize that a doctor is not good enough for you. Just gut check this. For example, you trust that all lawyers know law more than you, but you go and have referral with a certain lawyer, you realize he's not good for you, so you're going to go to more experienced lawyer. The same thing goes for all the professions and for doctors as well. You might know that doctor from Harvard is presumably better than doctor who just started working at NHS, right? Or doctor who is 60 years old is presumably better than another doctor. Secondly, why people still seek second opinion on our side of the house? Because if you are, only time when you need to seek a second opinion is when you are not getting better. And that's when people do seek second opinion. If I went to a doctor and I'm still sick and in pain, I'm not going to be oh, but doctors know the best, so I'm just going to lay in pain and wait to die. Obviously you're going to be okay, maybe there is a better doctor who might be able to help me. So I think that this entire point is completely ridiculous. Secondarily, why anti-vaxxers and RFK are a case that still happens on our side of the house and why they do happen more. Firstly, I think this is just cop-out. Obviously this is the best argument on opposition, so it was the easiest for OG to just say, but this debate is not about RFK. Yes, it definitely is. This debate definitely is about, because if you're not trusting doctors, you have to seek, knowledge somewhere. If you are sick and you don't trust doctor to help you, you have to try to find somebody else, right? An alternative is going on Reddit, talking to other people, seeking alternative medicine and things like this. Because this debate is about anti-vaxxers, because it's not just about going to doctor when you are sick. It's about listening to doctors' recommendation. For example, doctors recommend that you should vaccinate your child for polio, for measles, and all these kinds of things. And I want to weigh how important this is. We have the biggest outbreak of, polio or measles in the US since the vaccine was literally invented. That's not normal. Innocent children are literally dying from preventable diseases in awful pain. Have you seen a child that has polio? What happens to their limbs? This is an awful thing that's happening because of this motion. So yes, we prefer people trusting doctors that tell you just, vaccinate your child and all these kinds of things. Okay, next I want to talk about, because they're talking about patient-centric process and things like this. Firstly, I also want to clarify that case on entire gov bench is at best marginal, because medicine is amazing. Objectively, we have solved so many problems. We have treatment for almost all the problems that are happening. There are very fringe, there are cases I know somebody who has a problem with medical system, who has been fucked with medical system and things like that, but these are fringe cases, right? Vast majority of people, when they go to doctor, they do get treatment and all these kinds of things. So I want to say that comparative is more harm, because there is people who don't get, doctor's opinion who would have been better if they did went to doctor. Firstly, I want to clarify why sick people are bad at making decisions, and then why doctors are generally good, even without all the mechanisms that opening government talks about. Firstly, why people who are sick, who are seeking for second opinion, or not seeking for second opinion, but alternative medicine, are good, are not very good at this. Firstly, medicine is way too complicated. So even if we take best case scenario of opening government and say, oh, you do medical research on your own, you don't trust doctor with specific treatment, but you do medical research on your own. This is way too complicated for people to understand, right? For example, you don't know what NHL inhibitor is. You don't know what actual, consequences immunosuppression means. You might just think, oh, I might get a cold. You don't think about that you might get sepsis and all these kinds of things, right? So these are very complicated things. Secondly, this is very important. These people are vulnerable and gullible. There are people who tell them you don't have to go to chemo. You don't have to lose your hair and get ugly and skinny. You can just, shove coffee in your ass or whatever, coffee, whatever the fuck that treatment is, and you are going to be better, right? So these people, they want to believe that this is true. They want to believe that there is a better solution than what doctors is offering them. This is why we need to have a strong narrative that doctors are always right. So you go into the treatment that you might not like and all these kinds of things. Thirdly, they often want quick solutions and not long-term solutions. For example, you might want to take a drug that is going to fix you quickly, but it's going to cause you long-term issues that you're not thinking about, as opposed to treatment that lasts for a year or two and things like that. Secondly, why doctors are on net good and why they have incentive to listen to patients, be good to patients, and not overprescribe antibiotics. Firstly, doctors want to advance in their career. You study as doctor for 10 years, you go in so much depth and all these kinds of things, and then you work in NHS for 16 pounds per hour, when patients literally spit on you and things like that. That sucks ass, right? You want to improve as a doctor. You want to, be like a cool doctor that works in private clinic. You're going to do this if patients give you good reviews, if you research constantly, if you publish your own research, and if you're good to patients, right? Secondarily, I believe that most doctors have empathy, right? Like, they could have done something else. They chose to do this. They spent 10 years to study this and all these kinds of things. I genuinely do believe, like, when I see my doctor, who smiles at me, who's genuinely happy when I do better and all these kinds of things, I genuinely do believe that this is okay. Thirdly, most importantly, they want to avoid lawsuits for malpractice. These are huge amounts of money and all these kinds of things. Next, I want to talk about why there's going to be why these alternative treatments are bad. But for that, yeah.
Are doctors the only kind of medical professionals?
I mean, they are the best. And if you go to alternative medical professionals, people who are not, working with normal medication and all these kinds of things, those are people who are not doctors, then that's bad. Okay, why alternative medicine is bad? Firstly, it distracts you, even if it's not harmful actively, it can distract you from taking actual treatment. Like, you shove coffee in your ass instead of going to chemo and then cancer kills you. Secondarily, they can be actively harmful. Like, for example, there are massages that are recommended for people with cardiac issues. If you have cardiac issues and you take a massage, this increases your blood flow and it can literally kill you faster. So sometimes they're actively harmful and all these kinds of things, right? So next, I want to talk about how there's going to be less research. There's going to be less research because if less people are going to doctors, there's going to be less incentive to fund because new medication and all these kinds of things, because it's going to be less profitable, right? If less people go to doctor, less people believe in doctor, it's going to be less profitable to invest a lot of money. And research in medicine is incredibly expensive. It's very speculative. It takes a lot of trials and all these kinds of things, which means we need a lot of trust in doctors in order for this to be capable. Lastly, I want to impact this. There's going to be more sick people on their side of the house, which is bad for multiple reasons. Firstly, these very sick people eventually will have to go to doctor, which then clogs NHS, it clogs how you say doctor system and all these kinds of things. But also secondarily, these people, they cannot contribute to society. Yeah, if you are very sick, you cannot work, you cannot take care of your children, you traumatize your family. This has impacts beyond just the person that is sick. This is a horrible thing. Medicine is amazing. I'm very proud to stand on all of it.
The member of government to begin his closing half.
Good to go? Opening opposition, and indeed the whole of the top half, are completely under the spell of this narrative. They've forgotten half of the medical field. When we literally ask them, can you name any other medical professionals? The best they can reach for is different types of medicine. This is the problem. The narrative that doctors know best excludes huge amounts of the profession. Nurses, specially trained in day-to-day treatments that they give to people. Pharmacists who are able to prescribe basic medications to you. Public policymakers who can restructure our healthcare systems to make them more efficient. We think it is crucial that we diversify care, that we encourage patients to go to people who can specialise in their care to make them more efficient. That will be the extension. A few extraneous responses, though, to opening opposition before I go into it. First, on the idea of how this will reduce the amount of people that seek out care. First, if people believe that their pain is not real or they think it is not significant, they're just unlikely to seek out care anyway because they don't think it's something worthy of medical attention. That's completely symmetric. But second, I would posit that they are even less likely under this narrative because when you glorify doctors as someone who sacrifices or currently constantly under strain, that means that you are less likely to go and seek out. You worry that you will waste their time. You think they're probably doing a life-saving operation right now because they are this wonderful person in this amazing career. And as such, you're just unlikely to seek out their assistance because you believe you are invalid, unuseful to them. And crucially, because there are a lack of other options you can go forward for less serious issues, as will reason why we get more under our side. Second, on the claim of how you will, your attitudes toward doctors and whether you will mistrust them. First, I would flag the narratives around things like anti-vaxxers are not often even about doctors at all, but rather distrusting big pharma that they're going to do bad things with their vaccines, or distrusting the politicians which are encouraging you to take them. If those gain traction, they gain either way, and they're the core of the narrative. But second, I think Paula's characterization of what this narrative would look like about lawyers is much more akin to our side. No one says lawyers know best, but they do say lawyers might know better about the law. So the idea is that doctors have a cachet all of their own. They're above the rest of society. Within the comparative is they're more likely someone that you consult who has a very educated opinion. They need the best I will find, but that ultimately I get to make the choice. That out of the way, let's move on to our case. The thesis of this claim is that this narrative imbues doctors with a huge amount of political and social power, causing them to centralise and limit access to medical care. Why is this narrative specifically about doctors at the expense of other medical staff? First, when you have a dominant narrative that someone knows best, you need to explain why they know best, which means there's a huge amount of social and cultural emphasis on the types of training that they have, the specific rigour of training that they go through, the fact that it's maybe 5 or 6 years initially in medical school, and then 10 years upwards of training within, and specifically the things that they learn. Second, the cult of doctors and the way it's presented, the fact that you use doctor before your name, whereas nurse never introduce themselves as nurse, the fact that doctors are asked for on a flight and never any other medical professional. The point is that the cultural cachet they occupy is completely separated and elevated above other medical staff. Third, the likely structural historic distribution of who occupies these roles, the fact that doctors were often the people with the best access to medication, who were already trusted hugely by society, white men who seemed very trusting to you, who were big pillars of your village community who lived in the big house down the road, whereas nurses were often women who you thought might be able to be maternal but not offer medical care, which often means we have used our structural biases to imbue this distinction with even more power. The implication of this is that this narrative is uniquely at the expense of other medical staff. This is not a debate about the trust of medical institutions, but about doctors uniquely. There are two groups here who are often very qualified. A, people like nurses and pharmacists who are specialised in their types of care, like prescribing for low-level things or doing day-to-day operations like taking blood within the hospital. B, people like public health officials who are experienced in making things efficient, in using administration to make, with their medical expertise and knowledge, to make systems much more effective and efficient. 3 things that doctors do with this power that is bad. First, patients distrust other practitioners. Because doctors know best, you consistently believe they will offer you the best care. That looks like demanding that a doctor intubate you or take your blood, even though a consultant doctor will do that awfully and probably stab you in the arm. And that's because that's not what they're doing day to day, that's not what they're specialised in. But the belief that in all medical fields they know best means you often demand different types of care, which is not specialised. Why is this bad? First, your care is going to be worse. Doctors are overstrained, they're running to do day-to-day tasks in hospital they haven't done since medical school. You could get someone who is much more efficient. You get a prescription at your pharmacy much quicker than you could get at a GP appointment, but because of the demand for doctors, you're overstraining them. Second, you just have an awful experience. You're more likely to be distrusting of your nurse, which makes them quite angry at you that you don't believe in your care and you don't get a good experience when you seek out medical care, especially as nurses are often more likely to be relatable to you, have better bedside manner. They're more likely to be someone from your community than doctor is. Second, doctors override and mistrust other medical professionals. Often they'll ignore the initial nurse's notes that they offer because they think they don't have the expertise, because the doctors are high on their own supply through the nice white jacket that they wear. And the culture means that we require doctor final sign-off on everything, even basic prescriptions like a steroid cream, which a pharmacist should be able to offer you in many instances. Why is this often negative? First, there is major cost here. There is huge bureaucracy of doctors having to spend hours funneling through admin, approving prescriptions, writing their own handwritten notes when nurses could have done the job. Secondly, just a general delay on care. Again, the strain that they have when doctors choosing to override these other medical professionals mean it's much harder to get a GP appointment. What is the comparative for both of these instances? Medical fields have specialisation, and already that training happens, it's just not utilised under the status quo. There are some things doctors do not know best about. They know better about giving a neurological diagnosis, but administering things like an IV drip, they're pretty rubbish at because they didn't do it since medical school, whereas nurses do it every single day. We think when you diversify that trust among people institutions, so all the opening stuff about why you trust a medical institution still applies, but you spread that trust throughout more specialised than you do under their side. Opening.
Pharmacists can't examine you. You can just describe him your symptoms, which is incredibly vague, which means you might think you just have a rash when you in fact have UTI and you get sepsis because you didn't go to a doctor.
It's just like, again, this is the mistrust of pharmacists. If they think this is a rash, which could lead to that, as in it's something, they've learned about the symptoms, if there is a risk, they just refer you to a doctor. But 9 times out of 10, Paddle, it's a blooming rash and you need a cream, but you go to your GP. Like, run the risk with this, it's better. The third and final thing is more structural, and it's the way doctors exert political power. All doctors have to go through getting their training and then associations, things like residencies. Current doctors are the ones who control access to these. Currently, they have, one, a structural incentive to restrict access. They want their pay to remain high. They want to retain the cultural cachet. Second, they have the capacity, because of this narrative, it is suicide for politicians to go after doctors, to demand that they introduce more people into the profession, to demand that nurses get more care. We herald doctors as our saviours in times like COVID. The implication of this is that they use their political power to prevent people like nurses gaining more powers or more doctors entering the system. When we deconstruct this and they face more competition from people like nurses and pharmacists, they have to open up the medical profession because now they have to compete for the right to be trusted with our health. Closing government.
Thank you very much for this speech, and we now welcome the Member of Opposition to begin the closing op case.
Only visual POIs, please. Opening government claims that the distrust of doctors comes from within the medical system, so this is a legitimate internal process of discourse and scrutiny. Opening opposition says that this criticism comes from alternative medicine. Both are entirely correct. What we are going to do from closing opposition is explain why this narrative manifests in such a way that the distrust of doctors leads to a general mistrust of the medical system, and that you're more likely to believe the alternative medicine that opening opposition talks about than the internal criticism that OG talks about. What Paula says in response to opening opposition is that people generally don't understand medicine because medicine is extremely complicated. But what Aniket said in his PM is that the people who are talking about this are usually doctors who have accreditation like a PhD, so they know what they're talking about. But note that the average person cannot discern who is and isn't an epistemic authority within the medical establishment. Because when you have a doctor on a podcast like the Joe Rogan podcast, they might actually have a PhD. They say they are from the system, but you don't know if they are peer-reviewed or things like that, because this requires a specific insight into the academia who's popular within the system. The thing is that if you have a PhD for medicine, you can market yourself as an expert who knows this. In fact, you can even paint a victimization story on Joe Rogan, that you were ostracized from the community because you speak the truth. So given that most people don't have this specific type of knowledge, they can discern who from the medical profession is actually giving legitimate criticism and who isn't. But secondly, this creates a psychological slippery slope, because when you hyperfixate on general medical crises that did happen, when the medical establishment did lie about one thing, like in example in the US when they lied about the opiate crisis, this opens a window for further doubt. So maybe on TikTok, the first content you consume is about a legitimate crisis where they did fuck up. You're going to be suggested on your reels multiple content of schizos talking about the fact that the entire thing is fucked up and things like that. Why is this problematic? Because you're bombarded by these things on social media, because your phone is always next to you. So sure, OG, you can dive into legitimate sources like Wikipedia if you want to, but if you're just a passive observer like most people, you're going to be bombarded by this short-term content because it's easier to digest. It's easier to believe that doctors are evil and trying to poison you as opposed to being more nuanced. Thirdly, this leads to a path of least resistance, because nuanced criticism is cognitively taxing and most people simply don't have the time or resilience to go into this. But fourthly, there is massive skepticism towards the state in most developing countries. So what Aniket says in his PM is that educated people now know more about science and you have general education about medicine. But in a lot of developing states, due to the fact that you have poor medical infrastructure, as OG notes, people distrust the state because they have been messed up in the past. They feel resentment toward doctors because long queues and things like that. So they're more likely to not trust them and rather trust people who are respected within their folk medicine circles. The people that CG talks about, like you have a local witch doctor or things like that, because they're more proximate to you. Why is this important? Note that all the impacts that that OO talks about are extremely salient in this debate. Things like skipping medication, things like not getting vaccinated or not following the instructions of their doctors. But O impact only applies to the scale of people who are gullible and vulnerable. Sure, people are inherently gullible and vulnerable, but we prove why this is a large-scale thing that spreads to many people. It spreads to lots of people in developing countries who don't have access to education, who are susceptible to their local epistemic authorities, and to people in developed countries who go on TikTok. So we are able to access the same benefit, but scale it to a much larger extent. Before I move into my second extension, I'm very happy to engage with opening government.
Why is the first reaction to getting wrong advice to become an anti-vaxxer and not ask another doctor? It's not about coffee up your ass, it's just a less bad antibiotic.
Look, so this narrative is that doctors should be trusted. Your narrative is about distrust of doctors. I explained who the actors are, who the actors are, and why you're likely to engage with them. Second, why we actually get more scrutiny and reform within the medical system on our side of the house. Because now, how does our narrative manifest? Note that when you believe that doctors as an institution are trusted, that doctors in particular are trusted, you believe that they are the only authority that can help you. I won't take any more POIs. So you believe that all the other alternatives are scams. And sure, as OG says, it might be by blind faith. So let's say OG is right and you opt into this radically. You think the witch doctors are a scam. The alternative medicine are a scam. Only doctors can help you. Then more people think that they should be invested in medical discourse in the first place because this is the only actor that helps them. Why is this extremely important? Because within the medical establishment, we are getting huge structural reforms right now. More and more women across the world are graduating as doctors or nurses, which means that they are getting places on panel discussions and on boards where they can make big decisions. Secondly, you have government grants and NGOs that support more women and people of color joining the medical field, so you have an incentive to include them in your teams. But thirdly, reproductive care and things like racial justice are huge electoral issues. So the medical establishment is currently responding to the demands of women, for example, to get better reproductive care, because this is important to people. Why is this incredibly important? Because the discourse on their side of the house, at least partially, so even if you buy their mitigation, at least partially, moves to the alternative sources of medicine. The discourse becomes whether I should doubt medicine as a whole, as opposed to believing that, yes, medicine is generally good, but we are supposed to reform it from the inside. So on our side of the house, you actually talk more about how doctors who are good can actually make pacemakers, which are good for people of color, and that they accommodate their economy. You have more people talking about how we can get better reproductive health for women. The alternative is that on TikTok you talk about natural births, I should give birth in a pond and things like that, but here now you actually focus more on the actual medical establishment and what is happening within it. So this also tackles CG, because you can also talk about the unfairness towards nurses and things like that. But also, guys, sometimes hierarchy is good. Doctors know more than nurses because they are more educated. So I'm unsure about the way you should to listen to the people in the first place. But secondly, the people who valorize medicine, so the people who think that medicine is good in general, are also probably going to think that nurses are good. So maybe CG is right in like a really fringe case scenario where someone is socialized to particularly hate nurses, but most people who opt into the narrative of opposition are also going to like nurses. For all of these reasons, I'm happy to stand in closing opposition.
The government whip to close off government bench.
The key thing about the word best is that it's a comparative term. If you delete this narrative, given that doctors have studied medicine for many years, are very educated, very qualified people, the vast majority of individuals who need medical care and trust the system are still going to believe that doctors are better qualified than them. Where the largest margin in the debate is as between doctors and other kinds of medical professionals, because that is where the comparative comes in the most, where it's far more ambiguous and not visible to the average person without some influence from a narrative, which has the credibility and which ought to be trusted in these cases. Why do people often not go to the doctor? Why do they often delay, wait too late on their symptoms? It's because it's hard to get an appointment. It's expensive, it's clogged, it's delayed. Our argument from Closing Government was that doctors and the medical establishment are complicit in creating an overburdened, inefficient system that's far too costly, far too delayed. And the number of people right now who suffer waiting for hip replacements, who don't come in for their symptoms because they can't get an appointment because they don't have insurance access, is far larger than the number of people who are cranks and opt out. That's the very simple weighing for our extension, utterly unresponded to by MO, wins the debate. The first thing I want to talk about then is why the narrative manifests in the way that we demonstrate. The first thing to note is just that doctors are a cabal. They have medical associations which have immense amount of political power. They're heavily coordinated. They're extremely wealthy political donors. And every other narrative says you should trust these people. You should defer to them on how care needs to be delivered, on how the hierarchy needs to be structured, on who we trust and who we believe, how much nurses ought to be paid relative to them. And I know what Up will say. Doctors in countries like the UK are often underpaid, abused, etc. But the key thing is that the people under them, the nurses, the assistants, are abused in an even worse way. Underpaid, disrespected. Doctors don't listen to them because they have no institutional reason to and no political incentive, because there's no payer, especially in single-payer health systems, who says the buck stops here, the costs decrease. Every time a doctor needs to sign off on a prescription, every time they need to look at a radiologist's screen, when it could have been done by someone else, that is a bill in the system. There's often no institution or actor who has ready political availability and access to stop these excess costs from ballooning, which is why much of the world is being eaten by medical costs as the world ages, and it's extremely important that these systems become more efficient. Now, it doesn't become more efficient because we let them go to the village witch doctor. It becomes more efficient because we let them go to a nurse who studied at a real college for 2 to 3 years, because we let them go to a pharmacist who sees a rash, thinks, oh, I can read a diagnostic chart because I spent 2 years studying this, and if I feel over my head, I'm obviously going to refer it up the chain. So of course, hierarchies are real and good. We're not proposing to deconstruct the hierarchy. We're proposing to better specialize and indeed better use a hierarchy that we are arguing that doctors have structurally, via the guild system, abused and undermined. That was utterly misunderstood by closing opposition in terms of what our extension is. Direct responses now to the op case on why people distrust the system. First thing, just the weighing that I noted earlier. If there is more availability of doctors, you are more likely to go when you have a niggling pain to the doctor. Second, the reasons why people think that they don't have the pain are often about things like pride, often older cultural values, etc., which are not changed even if you think the doctor knows best, because you just don't think there's a problem in the first place. Third, the doctor is very intimidating and scary. A nurse is far more likely to be working class and so on, and likely to relate to you when you go and talk to them. But the problem is, in a direct person-to-person exchange, if you think doctors know best, you just don't really take that nurse seriously. Why bother talking to them? Why not just immediately demand to escalate up the chain and get to a doctor first? I want to see a doctor now. I need an appointment now. That often means that people who are better placed to advocate for themselves in the system, who are more confident, who are often better spoken, are the ones who get access to doctors first. And when there are limited amounts of spots, that locks out disadvantaged minorities, poor people, etc., who don't know how to use the system, who don't know how to book appointments when it's really clogged, you need to log in at 7 a.m. to get an appointment that day. That is the reality of the healthcare system across much of the world, and that is the problem that we are proposing to solve. Second, many governments all around the world are beginning, just very nascently, to propose schemes like let's let pharmacists give more prescriptions, or let's let nurses do more procedures. These meet massive political resistance from medical lobbies that spend millions, hundreds of millions on lobbying campaigns to stop this because they have their own little fiefdom. They don't want to give up on the supply, they don't want to get undercut, and they take advantage of the way that they've collectively convinced the public that this is the only possible way to deliver medical care. And look, there are countries that do this model better. Like Germany, for example, uses an integrated care model where there are large offices of family doctors that are also with other nurses and specialists. Like, this isn't rocket science. But much of the world has not embraced this model because it's difficult to advocate for, difficult to redesign. But there are pressures to do it, right? Rising healthcare costs around much of the world mean that governments are going to be forced into some action to reform. The relevant question is, how does that reform happen? Who leads it? Who does the public listen to? And what kind of model do we use to redesign the system? Regarding weighing of this over opening government, I think the core gist of opening government that's likely to lead to overprescription is just not likely to be large in margin. A, because as teams acknowledge, the opioid crisis happened in the 1990s. There have been a large amount of reforms that have been made, and the public is far more increasingly aware of problems of over-medicalization, as OO correctly pointed out. Second of all, just in terms of overprescription, doctors are probably relatively competent people. Opening government hasn't really explained what its structural incentives still persist that mean that the over-medicalization is happening. It seems like people getting access to say like ADHD medication is good, and opening government hasn't really given us a reason to explain why that is a bad thing per se.
People already expect nurses to draw blood and pharmacists to give ibuprofen, but doctors are the only medical professional able to diagnose illness and prescribe advanced treatment. There is no conflict of interest. CG is marginal.
You're using the word is, not ought, though. The point is that they ought often to be able to do more things than they currently are within the system. We agree there are kinds of diagnoses that obviously doctors should be the only ones who can make. But there is obviously a massive spectrum of things in between drawing blood and cancer diagnosis, which nurses, who often have 20 years of experience in a hospital ward seeing patients, who are intelligent people, who are often spoken down to by doctors high on their own supply, not listened to. And regarding OO's own weighing and opening government's own weighing about, like, what if you have a medical condition that isn't going to be acknowledged by the doctor or so on? Often it's nurses who are the ones who find out about like some rare condition because the patient complains about pain, but they just don't listen to the nurse or don't really view them as credible. And there's no institutional system where nurses can often report these things in a formalized way because everything runs through the doctor's handwritten note. Everything runs through the doctor's ability to refer you to someone else. That slows down and clogs down the system. But it also means the kind of people likely to fall through the cracks from both opening teams are, where we're often like nurses or a pharmacist could be their best advocates, are structurally unable to access those systems. Why does this then weigh over the rest of the round? A, because the margin of change on how much you trust the medical system overall is not likely to be large. Closing opposition is probably right that it's hard to assess like a doctor who goes on Joe Rogan in terms of whether he is a better doctor than some other doctor because they both say doctor. But in a world where you say doctors know best, that problem persists, right? You don't know whether the Joe Rogan doctor is more credible than the doctor at your clinic. So the problem is still broadly there. People are just bad at identifying these details. Second of all, the margin of changes is way larger. The public knows that both doctors, nurses, etc. should be respected. The relevant question is institutions that mediate our interaction with the medical care system. How are they structured? What kinds of financial and social incentives exist? How much do you trust the other actors? The person you probably spend more time with than a doctor, the nurse, the pharmacist, etc. That was a clear margin of victory for closing government.
Opposition whip to close off the fourth round of EUDC 2025.
Yes, okay. The first thing I want to do is I want to briefly respond to closing government because I want to get this over with. So there is a reason and a way in which the authority that doctors have trickles down, and this is why the burden is usually eased down on doctors. Why? When you go to the doctor, oftentimes doctor tells you, the nurse is going to draw your blood. I'm going to send you to the pharmacy. The pharmacist is going to prescribe you the medicine that I want to give you. And this is how you know. Insofar the doctor knows the best and you trust him and he trusts these people, you're going to trust them too. The first time doctor does that, you know that you can consult your local pharmacist. You know you can consult your nurse because they also know good because your doctor trusts them and he knows the best. He knows who to trust, you trust them too. But secondly, doctors have incentives to do this. First, you probably work with to be nice to nurses and to also allow them to establish authority and for them to help you. Why? First, you work with them, you respect them, you spend the whole day in an office with them, you're human, you have empathy and connection with them. Secondly, they also want to ease the burden. Opening opposition is correct to say that they are overworked and underpaid. You probably don't want every single grandma in your city contacting you to draw their blood, and this is why you work on establishing the authority so you can provide care more efficiently and you can do these to give these menial things to nurses. What you take upon yourself and where you don't trust the nurses is the fields where they don't have expertise because you know they can mess up and then you're all liable for a lawsuit, meaning closing government's case is irrelevant in this debate. Now I want to talk about our case and how we weigh over the rest of the debate. Our case is simple. Currently you have competing authorities that are trying to claim they're trying to stake their claim on medicine and claiming that they are the authority within medicine. What we have when we have the narrative of the doctor knows the best, we have a clear messaging to the people that the doctors and the medical system are uniquely the only ones that can help you. They are the ones that can save your life. They are the ones that have the answer to your questions. And this is how we fight off the alternative medicine. Now, why is this important? Because when you believe that the thing that is going to save your life and the thing that is going to help you is uniquely the doctor and there is no way out, you are more likely to put the pressure on the system to change. You are more likely to fund your local NGO that pushes more female doctors. You're more likely to make reproductive rights your first and primary voting issue. These things are possible when you are aware that the only thing you can do is fight the system. Because opening government is correct to say that a lot of people struggle. Sometimes you get the wrong diagnosis. Sometimes your doctor doesn't listen to you because you're a woman. What happens then is on their side of the house, they tell you, doctors don't always know the best. which is then same for the alternative medicine, because the critique against alternative medicine is, in a lot of cases, alternative medicine is wrong. Insofar, it's the same as doctors. For you, the trade-off is different. You're more likely to opt into alternative medicine. You're less likely to fight the system because you're tired of fighting the system, and this is how you stop applying systematic pressure. So what we proved to you in our case, no thank you, is firstly that you have an incentive to fight the system, even though it's increasingly difficult because you're in pain going to a doctor and he isn't believing you. But secondly, there is a specific capacity within the medical field to change it now. This looks like more women entering the medical field and NGOs having the platform to tell them you have to fight for other women. This looks like reproductive rights being really important in the USA right now. Insofar, we believe that the only thing that can save us is the medical system. This is how you galvanize people to fight for changes, and these are systematic changes that trickle down to everyone. Now I want to talk more about opening government, because I do believe that their case is more relevant on the government bench. What they tell you is that this narrative is going to be propagated by officials, and these are going to be doctors. What we are telling you is that this narrative is going to be co-opted by bad actors who are TikTok influencers and who do not know anything about medicine. Why? Because those people are incredibly skilled in using the algorithm and getting on people's social media. Is the language they use, which is like, did you ever feel pain after your period? This may be endometriosis, which a doctor cannot say in those terms because he doesn't use TikTok language. Secondly, they use hashtags for algorithms which push their content above the content of the doctors. Thirdly, they have some type of platform which already exists. Currently, currently what is happening is insofar people believe that only the doctor has the key and only the doctor has an answer, they dismiss these people. Insofar they can say, look at these real doctors that opening government is talking about, pushing out research that identify that doctors do not know the best. This means that our theories about other alternative medicine existing, being good, and us being able to sell it to you is now legitimized by the medical community that the opening government claims is going to be the one doing the criticism. Because majority of people cannot engage with research a doctor writes about how women are not getting treated, but they can engage with a TikToker saying, look, a real doctor supports my claim. Now buy my super copy and shove it up your ass, as Paula tells you. Which means that this is the comparative on opening government, because no doctors are not influencers. They do badly on the algorithm. You only have a couple of them that are famous, and it's unlikely that those 3 ones which are famous are going to be the ones critiquing the system, which means that like fake, bogus people are going to use this research and use it to legitimize their bogus alternative medicine. This is better claims than those coming from opening opposition. Now, why is this specifically important in women and minorities and those people that we are talking about? Because oftentimes those people are the ones that have to fight the system the most. You are not believed by a doctor. You come there claiming that you have horrible period pain, and he tells you this is normal. You shouldn't be complaining about this. You come to a second doctor, and he tells you the same, because doctors oftentimes do not know a lot about these types of things. Those are the people who are not accommodated by the system. What happens with them on government? They do not fight the system, because now the alternative medicine and the margin of difference between alternative medicine and normal medicine is smaller, which means that it is easier for you to opt into the alternative medicine, because if insofar nothing is like, honestly, if nothing is inherently true and nothing is good for you, this means that it is easier for you to opt into alternative medicine. You don't have to face your doctor again. You don't have to fight him again. You don't have to experience the humiliation of going to his office again. You don't have to enter his office and beg him for a diagnosis because he diagnosed you wrongly. What you have to do is you have to opt into social media, and you can look a person and then read all the comments saying, oh, this really helped me, and hope for this to help you. And this is how you stop fighting the system and fighting for structural before that opening.
You are correct that trust in the medical system is the only way to save your life is correct, but it's which prescription within the medical system that is important. That is the cost of not having to explain your treatments on their side of the house.
No, but we already explained to you that the difference here is that on our side of the house, you still question the system. The difference is, and coming from closing opposition is, will you question it the third and the fourth time and find a doctor that suits you, or are you going to opt into the alternative medicine, which happens insofar you believe that no doctor is going to give you an honest answer? Now, why is this the most important impact within the debate? Because know that the majority of people who are accommodated by the system opt into the system either ways. This means that if you're a white man and you're complaining about how it pains you and how it hurts you, and your doctor treats you nicely and your nurse brings you a cookie after she draws your blood and you get treated, you're probably going to go there either ways, and for you nothing changes because you do not opt into this. For minorities and people who are discriminated, not accommodated, and who constantly have to fight, they are the ones who are easily co-opted by alternative medicine. Now, why they're the most important actor? Note that oftentimes they work harder jobs, which means they're more physically in pain. They're oftentimes underpaid, which means that they cannot afford themselves good healthcare, good supplement, and good nutrients. Oftentimes they have the most mental health issues because they're facing discrimination and constantly have to be afraid for their physical safety. Oftentimes there's a threat of violence that they face. These are horrible things which are implemented on them, which which are horrible for their quality of life, and they are the ones the most in pain. But also, being that they are the most vulnerable actor that we help. But secondly, not the systematic change. Insofar we do exert political pressure, we are changing the curriculum in schools, we are changing the procedure, and we are helping the whole system, not only marginalized cases of people getting treated. For these reasons, closing up.